Start shooting video in manual settings, ISO, shutter speed, aperture. What is it? I will explain it in this video. First of all, why? Shooting video in the automatic settings can give it like a sort of amateur look. And also sometimes you want to give it the look you have in your head. I will talk about the three most important settings on your camera: ISO, shutter speed, and the aperture. Shutter speed. Shutter speed is the setting that is often displayed as 1/250 or 1/50. And that's because shutter speed is how long the light hits the sensor. So, for example, 1/200 means every 200th of a second there is light hitting the sensor. And that of course also influences how bright your picture is. But besides how bright your picture will look, there is a much more important consequence, and that is how smooth your picture will look. Okay, here is me walking or running across the screen. You see me do that with different shutter speeds. But also if we pause it, you see that it is a super soft picture. And that softness is called motion blur. And now you see me walking or running across the screen with different kind of shutter speeds. And then you see that it gets better and better when the shutter speed is higher. And the last clip is me with 1/10,000th of a second. And if I'm going higher than 3200, the picture is too dark. And if I pause this video, you see it's a super crispy, sharp image. And then you think that's a good thing, right? But not really. The first one is just not usable enough, and the last one with a very fast shutter speed is not realistic enough. Because if we are looking with our human eyes, we also always see some motion blur. So for that there is a rule called the 180-degree shutter rule. And that rule is that if we want to have the most realistic amount of motion blur, then we should pick a shutter speed that is double the frame rate we're shooting in. Aperture. Aperture is something most of the time displayed as a F number, so f3.7. And where shutter speed controls how long the light is hitting the sensor, aperture controls how much light is hitting the sensor. It controls how much by making the hole in the lens bigger or smaller. This is a super wide aperture like f22, and then when the hole gets bigger, you get something like f1.7 in this case. So together with the shutter speed, this also controls the brightness of your picture. The higher the f number, so like a f22 for example, the darker your picture. But also here there's something much more important happening when you're changing your aperture. And that is that you're also changing your shadow depth of field, which is a super fancy name for a blurred background. I would say look at these examples, the first one, the last one. That's super important, and that's something you can control when you're shooting in automatic settings. The aperture is, by the way, almost always determined on which lens you're using. This lens is a f1.7 lens, and that means that the lowest aperture is f1.7. If you want like a more cinematic video, you shoot with a very low aperture. If you want more in focus, more of landscape videography or something, you shoot with a very high aperture. ISO. What is ISO? ISO is the name of an organization, International Organization for Standardization. Okay, you should forget that right now because that's not important. What important is that ISO is the setting of how sensitive the sensor is for light. The lower the ISO, the less sensitive the sensor is for light, so the darker your picture. A high ISO number, very sensitive for light, so a brighter picture. But the biggest thing to remember with ISO is the higher the ISO, the brighter your picture, but also the more noise your picture will have. So most of the times you want to keep your ISO as low as possible. when I zoom in on this video, you see the more noise the video will have. A high ISO number, a brighter picture, but also more noise in your video. And that's something you don't want, but that's ISO. These were the 3 settings, but how do you use those settings? I personally always start with the shutter speed and with the 180-degree shutter rule. The next step is the aperture. How much shadow depth of field do I want? And then there's only one last setting left, and that's the ISO. So if my picture is too bright or too dark at this point, I can adjust that with the ISO. The biggest tip I can give to you is just practice with these settings to know exactly what everything does. But I really hope you learned something new from this video. If you did, don't forget to subscribe, because this is ShootThatVideo, the channel where I upload all kinds of informational videos about filmmaking. Because remember, wherever, however, no excuses, just shoot that video. I hope to see you next week. Bye!